Great, thank you. Welcome, everyone, to our Delta Think News and Views discussion series. For those of you who've joined us before, welcome back. And we're happy to see you again. And if you're new here, we're glad you decided to join us today. First, let me start with a few introductions. I'm Lori Carlin, Chief Commercial Officer here at Delta Think, and I'll be moderating our session today. With me are my colleagues, Heather Stain, Strategy Consultant here at Delta Think and Director of Community Engagement for our Data and Analytics tool, and Dan Pollock, our Chief Digital Officer, and along with Ann Michael, an architect of our Data and Analytics tool. If you've joined us for a News and Views discussion webinar before, then you know they're designed to be interactive with lots of questions and participation from you all. So I hope you've got your questions ready, and we look forward to a lively and informal discussion. A few logistical items before we begin. When you have a question, please ask it in the Q&A box. As far as structure, we'll have some opening remarks from Dan and Heather to start us off, and then we'll move into the questions and open discussion. And we're set to go for an hour here today. If the discussion ends earlier, then we'll end earlier. So that's just what we expect from the scheduling. So, thank you again for joining us, and I'll hand off to Heather now to get us started.
Thanks, Lori. It's great to be here to speak with everyone today. Many of you have probably seen our most recent news and views, which published yesterday. We'll be talking about the highlights from that and showing some of the graphics from there as well. We do this APC data project every year. It's been underway for going on 10 years now. And Dan, who's always very humble, would probably undersell the amount of work that he puts on into this project, although maybe not. We also have to acknowledge our colleague Meg White, who was heavily involved this year. And with a lot of the work that's done on that, we do believe that it is the most comprehensive, long-running APC data set and is most accurate for the uses that publishers and libraries would like to put it to. So if you have questions about the methodology behind that, we can talk about that as well. We're going to kick off today with Dan talking a little bit more detail about method and headlines. And really, if you've been here before, you'll kind of know how we progress through this. As always, a caveat, that these we're talking about, averages and trends across the industry, how these trends apply specifically to you, may vary depending on the subject area that you publish in, or if you're from our library side, the subject areas that your researchers are most active in. Publisher size can also make a difference in interpreting these trends, and of course, the spread of prices across the portfolio. So we'll be touching, on many of those issues. And with that, I will hand over to Dan to give us the headline.
Thank you, Heather. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, depending on where you are. So yes, a brief word about methodology, and then we'll get into the headlines and the results. Every year we survey various or list price article processing charges, APCs. Our sample covers around 30 or so scholarly publishers, but as some of those are actually acting as publishing platforms for others, we put that number at around about 40 or so. And then there's loads of other small ones that are pulled into those big platforms. Our data set covers around about 20,000 titles or so going back to 2016. So we are now in the 10th year of this. And then, as Heather said, we think it represents a pretty comprehensive view. To give you a sense of context, we think our APC journal sample covers around about 40% of commercial scholarly journal output. So that's stuff that's published for which money may change hands or may not if it's subsidized or free. But we think that's a pretty comprehensive footprint and chunk of the market. And then just a quick bit of nuance. We need to compare things like for like, particularly to get annual trends, which we'll speak about this chart in a short while, but it's an example of annual trends. So what we do is we take a snapshot of prices towards the end of January every year. Now, publishers may increase their prices at different times of the year, but if we take a sample at the same time every year, then we can compare like for 1 year to the next. And then secondly, we look for the prices of peer-reviewed research articles or review articles, if there's no such thing as a research article, the peer-reviewed stuff, non-discounted, so before any member discounts or waivers or that sort of thing. And we go for, if you like, the classic open access license. So that's the CC BY, Creative Commons Attribution Only license, because we find that some publishers, for example, might charge a little bit less for a more restrictive license, such as the CC BY NC, Creative Commons Attribution non-commercial use. So what we try and do is we take a similar level of license as well, and that way we can get a fair view of comparing journals with journals, publishers with publishers, and years with years, so we can then infer some trends from it. So with all of that nuance and detail out the way, what are the headline changes? Well, going into 2026, average APCs continue to increase, and the level of that increase is getting slightly larger each year. So the increases are increasing. That appears to be the longer term trend. So as we were talking during the preparation of this and saying, basically, things continue to get more expensive. There's an old joke about two things in life are certain: death and taxes. I would argue three things in life are certain: death, taxes, and ongoing price increases. And that is what we are seeing here. The reason I call that out is 2 years ago, in 2024, we saw a particularly large increase in prices driven by inflations, macroeconomic stuff, and various things happening in the environment. So things aren't as bad or as good, depending on whether you're buying and selling. So they're not as there's not as big increases as there were 2 years ago. Last year, that level of increase fell back. This year, it's increased a little bit more, and that appears, as I said, to be the underlying trend of increasing prices at steadily increasing increases. To put some numbers on this, we split journals into fully open journals, which many people refer to as gold journals, but as people also refer to gold open access, we will refer to fully open journals, gold journals. That's what we call them, fully open, because we feel that that's self-explanatory. Fully open APC list prices across our sample has risen about 6.8% on average this year compared with last year. That price increase this time last year was 6.4%. So here we're seeing that example. Last year 6.4, this year 6.8%. There is that increasing price increase. And then if we look at hybrid journals, so these are journals that offer people or authors in particular an option of whether they wish to not pay an APC and have their article sit behind a paywall, or pay an APC for an open access option. The prices of those hybrid open access options have risen on average 5.3% going into this year. And that compares with a 3% average increase last year. So there's been quite a noticeable increase in hybrid price increases and a mild increase in fully open price increases. I hope all of that makes sense. If it doesn't, we're happy to try and attack it a different way. So please do put something in the question. And then just to give you a sense of what's happening at the top and bottom end of the market, our methodology does not include APCs that are zero. So journals that do not charge an APC at all, or set their APC at zero, perhaps because they are offering an introductory discount. And the reason we do that, because if we did that, it would skew the averages. Our view is, if publishers are going to charge for it, what is the average charge going to be? And that's what those percentage increases are referring to. At the top end of the market, however, of course, that's worth looking at. The most you will pay for a fully open journal, the largest APC you will pay remains 8,900 US dollars. And we convert all of our prices to US dollars so we can compare like for like. And then secondly, the maximum APC you will pay for a hybrid journal, that has now risen to 12,850 US dollars, and that's up about $160 from this time last year. Okay, so those are our headline price increases: 6.8% fully open, 5.3% hybrid, top end $8,900 open, fully open, 12,850 hybrid. And as I said, I think as well as as a hybrid, or sorry, as well as prices steadily, or I'll rephrase, as long as price increases steadily increasing each year, there's a couple of other patterns in the data that we've seen are fairly consistent. As a general rule, fully open journals are increasing their share of the market. So this year there were 2.4 times more hybrid journals than fully OA ones, but last year there were 2.6 times more hybrid journals than fully OA ones. So the fully OA numbers of journals have increased, and if you like, they are eating into the numbers of hybrid journals. And then 3 years ago, there were almost 3 times as many hybrid journals as there were fully open ones. So I think that's just a pretty important macro pattern across the market. We're seeing a sort of systemic shift from hybrid to fully open, but hybrid journals do very much remain the majority of journals. Now, that then brings us on to this chart. This chart is showing or analyzing hybrid journals. Because hybrid journals make up the majority of journals in the market, you'll find if you draw this same chart for the whole marketplace, for both sorts of journals, you're going to get a very similar shape, simply because hybrids dominate in number. Now let's break down what is a pretty complicated chart. I promise you, it does get simpler once you pull it apart. What we do every year is, for 1 year's prices, we analyze what are the most popular price bands, and we break journals into price bands of 500 journals. What you can do when you plot that on a chart, you get what's known as a histogram, where what you're seeing is how many journals live in various price points. And so you go from left to right on the chart, we're going from cheaper to more expensive. And what we're saying is, as you get more expensive, more and more and more journals use that price point. And then that tops out somewhere in the middle. And then as you get really, really, really more expensive, fewer and fewer journals use that price point. That histogram for 1 year, if you draw a line across the top of it, you get one of the lines on the chart. And if we then repeat that exercise for every single year's data, you get this chart where each line is showing you the spread of popular price bands for 1 year. As we move from darker to lighter, red to green, we are going from older to newer. So the dark green lines are the oldest. As you go to yellow and red, you're getting to the latest year's data. So we can now see, if you like, the shape of the pricing and how that's evolving over time. How are things becoming cheaper or more expensive? And basically, in the very, very early days, what we found was the most popular price point was kind of sitting in the middle of the chart, just around the 1. And then the most popular price point became a bit cheaper for a few years. So you saw the peak of the chart shift to the left. And then a few years ago, it basically started to come back again. So we now find the most popular price point is sitting there sort of bang in the middle of the chart. What we've seen at the bottom right is, a few years ago, the most expensive journals really started to push out to the right as some of the very, very high impact journals began introducing APCs for the first time. So the highest APCs moved from kind of top 5,000s into $8,000, $9,000, $10,000 and above. And then finally, what we're seeing is the shape of the chart, or the shape of the line, is changing. And you'll notice in the earlier years, the peaks are very, very narrow, and actually quite symmetrical. So that suggests there's a real concentration of very, very popular price bands at the kind of middle price point. And then as soon as you move away from those popular price bands, relatively few journals use them. As time has gone on, what we're finding is publishers are moving their journals increasingly from the middle, the most popular by price band. They are moving them into the slightly more expensive price bands. So you find the chart peaks flatten, and there's a bulge coming into the right-hand side of the chart, just to the right of center. So that's saying an increasing share of journals are charging more and more APCs. And you'll notice in particular, I think this year, the red line has actually now got quite a wide spread and has become quite flat, suggesting there's quite a wide spread now of popular APCs, and they are shifting to the right, to the more expensive end of the spectrum. And I think that could explain that relatively, that leap in price increases of hybrid journals. Publishers are simply opting for a slightly more expensive option. The other thing, the subtlety on these charts is the number of journals is represented by the area under the curve. So if you've got a very, very tall, skinny curve, that the peak will be higher. If you've got a flatter, wider curve, the peak will be lower, but you might have a roughly similar number of journals because the area under the chart remains largely constant. We are seeing a slow but steady increase in the numbers of hybrid journals, but just please don't think that because the number of journals, if you like, or the peak of the curve has gone down, that there's somehow a reduction in journals. There isn't. So the headline for hybrid there is the most popular price band is becoming wider. There's a bigger spread of prices that the publishers are charging, and that spread is getting steadily more expensive. So that's hybrids. If we then move on to fully open access, thank you very much, Heather. What we see, again, this is the same chart. So each line represents the spread of prices for 1 year. We're coloring the lines in the same way. So darker, older, through to red, newer. And what we're seeing here is in the very, very early years, there was a double hump in the chart, suggesting there were two very, very popular price bands. Second thing to notice is all of these price bands are towards the cheaper, the left-hand side of the chart. So as a general rule, fully open journals charge less than hybrids. And if you actually look at the data, on average, fully open journals charge about 2/3 of the price of hybrids. And that difference has been pretty consistent over time. Then the other thing, we've gone in the earlier days from this sort of double hump to something that's moving increasingly to look like hybrid in the early days. So you are finding we're moving more towards one defined peak. So I think there's sort of a sense of a more popular price band. But again, like hybrids, the right-hand edge of the chart is beginning to bulge out more, suggesting that publishers are beginning to move their journals up the price band scale and therefore effectively exacting higher prices. Finally, on fully open, there is a very, very wide spread of popular prices. So in that sense, the fully open journal pricing market overall, I think, is much more varied, whereas hybrids tend to be a little bit more concentrated, if you like, on fewer price bands. I suspect that reflects the underlying business drivers behind the two models. Laurie, Heather, please make a note of a question, or somebody feel free to ask that, and I'm sure we can dive into that in more detail. That's really it. Couple of other headline things. Looking at fully open journals in particular, around just under a quarter of them charge no APCs at all. So the journals with no APCs are not shown on this chart, as I said before. But if subscribers to our tool who can come into these charts and interact with them and see the axes labeled and put all the numbers on it, they can switch that back on, and then you can start to see exactly kind of what slice of the fully open market is free of APC charges. That is important because of the rise of subscribe to open and similar sponsorship style models. So I'm sure we could unpack that if we wanted to. And then finally, and I think the single most important takeaway beyond prices continue to increase, is your mileage may vary. We are showing you here the industry-wide averages. These patterns will change significantly depending on the discipline you are in. So depending on the collections you might be buying or the area of publishing that you might be active in. So what goes on in physics may be different to what goes on in law or in medicine or so on and so forth. And so that's why we say please do get in touch. The tool we have behind this allows you to dice and slice this data across about 200 different subject areas, and that can be really, really useful when you're understanding the costs if you're buying or the potential income if you're selling. As ever, we try and stay neutral and sit in the middle. So I will pause for breath there. I hope that's given you a walkthrough of some quite detailed headlines, headline price increases, trends, and then unpacked the spread of those across the market and how that might be influencing the dynamics of the whole pricing setup. Heather.
Yeah, thanks for that, Dan. And I was going to jump in, and you started to cover this to say what we use these charts for, other than the fact that we eagerly look forward to see what they look like each year, because as you can tell, they're really cool. On the publisher side, we might be helping publishers either right size their APC pricing. So dividing these by subject areas. If you're newer journals that are thinking of establishing an APC, we can pop on, the zero or low cost APCs here, as well as a subject area, to see, what kinds of numbers and what kinds of journals, you might be contending with. And then on the library side, we will often take the research output of an institution, if you have the DOIs for your research or publications, roll that up to ISSNs, and then map that against the different pricing bands for a given publisher to see if you're going into a negotiation or a renegotiation of a read and publish agreement. Depending upon where your researchers are publishing along that continuum, you may or may not, have a good deal going. So it's some of the things that we actually do on a daily basis, practical, use cases of these types of charts. So.
Uh, if I may, there's a couple of questions I'll address. Three. I think somebody asked about there being no dollars in the first slide. My high school physics teacher would really not approve of this chart because I haven't labeled my axes. Hands up, mea culpa on that one. Because this is a very, very public domain presentation, we're not presenting numbers on the axes. That's something we feel is appropriately reserved for our subscribers. But yes, we convert everything to US dollars. And methodology will basically take the publisher's stated price in US dollars if available. Many publishers do cite prices on that, even if they are not based in the US. In the event a publisher is not offering price lists in US dollars, we will take it in their native currency, and we will then convert their currency back to US dollars at the average prevailing exchange rates for the publication year in question. So the journals published in 2024, we use the average dollar to X conversion rate for 2024. So that's essentially how we deal with the currency side of things. 2026 hybrid increases, that's skewed by any extreme APC price increases. What's the median increase of hybrid in 2026? Short answer is I don't think there's been a particular skewing. There's just a sort of general movement of journals up the price point bands. In terms of the median increases, very similar to average. So behind the scenes in our data, and again in our tool, we will always highlight median and average prices. So the median being, if you like, the midpoint, and average being the arithmetic average. The point is averages can be skewed by extremes at either end. And if the shape of a curve, such as the one you see, is kind of wonky to one side than the other, you'll see the average shift in one way and the median kind of stay set. What we've actually found is median versus average gives you a sense of the skewedness of the curve, but broadly the two numbers are pretty close. So plenty of statistical stuff that users can get their hands into, but I don't think it's really going to affect the headlines here. You can run with those kind of percentage increases anyway. And then is the systematic shift caused by flipping from hybrid to fully OA, or dynamics of journal creation being mostly full OA? I'm actually going to hand that back to you, Heather, because we were beginning to allude to this, weren't we, during the prep for this call. Wonder if you have any comments.
Yeah. Thanks for that. So one of the things that Dan and I were talking to were, numbers of hybrids versus numbers, of full and kind of what was going on there. And we think a couple of things are happening. Some publishers have been flipping, their portfolio and turning journals that had been hybrid, for a while, into fully OA. It's true that we continue to see fully OA launches happening, so both of those things, both transforming journals into fully OA and then also creation of new journals and also the subscribe to open, where we know that there's some complexities, around, reporting license and open status for those because they're open now, but that might not have a permanent status, nor may publishers open their entire backlist. Some do, some don't, some varies by subscribers or not. So we know that the numbers of Folio A are including those subscribed to open, but there's some complexities and nuances around that. So.
All
Couple
right.
of things
Great.
to
Go ahead, Dan.
A couple of things to add to that. As a general rule, changing journal models from hybrid to fully open, whatever, tends to account for a very, very small proportion of journals each year. That seems to be a pattern that we've observed. But there will be occasional outliers and bursts of activity. So some publishers, such as I think ACM last year and IET a few years ago, will say they will announce that as a matter of policy for whatever reasons they will cite, they are going to shift their entire portfolio from a mix or whatever it was to a fully open portfolio. So we may see that happening as essentially a mission-driven change by a particular society, and that can affect several dozen journals at a time. So of course that might flip the needle a little bit. And then I think, yeah, Heather mentioned subscribe to open. We've seen quite chunks of lists this year move journals across the subscribe to open, and that effectively might move them from a hybrid into the fully open category just because of the way we categorize things. I think it's a very interesting question, but as Heather said, there's a lot of nuance behind the
Yeah,
scenes.
and I'll just add one more thing because, our goal for this is that Lori does not get to ask her question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, that one of the benefits of collecting this data for as long as we've been collecting it is when there is a noticeable change, we will zoom in and look at what's happening. Why are there 30 fewer journals showing up on a price list for this publisher compared to last year? Was it the case that some journals left, some journals changed their model, and because we have all of that past data, we can see immediately when something, might be missing. So again, I think the benefit of having this data over time means we can catch those things more quickly and zoom in. And it's always we just went through this exercise in the past few weeks, and it's really interesting to look at, what's moved, what's merged, what's ceased. And it's definitely a lot of activity going on under what looks like just some lines on a graph.
Yeah, absolutely. And no, I'm fine to let you both talk back and forth and just listen. I learn something new every time we have these conversations, and especially since this data is hot off the press. For those of you who got our news and views yesterday, you know that this is very, very recent, this analysis. Um, so moving on to some of our other questions, are you seeing a pattern of increasing APC prices for newly launched OA journals as opposed to existing? So are they starting out at a certain price point and staying there when they're newly launched? Are they moving up? What is there any pattern between newly OA versus ones that have been in existence for quite some time?
Can I jump in, Dan? I'm going to channel Dan and say it's complicated. Everyone who's launched a new journal or submitted to a new journal knows that many times there are introductory periods, 1, 2, sometimes even 3 years, where there's no APC charge. Now there may be an APC posted but not charged, or it may remain silent. So when we're talking about those non-APC journals, and we do analysis over the course of the year where we do look at, diamond or sponsored journals. We look at journals that have not charged an APC for more than 3 years for that reason, to filter out what's probably in an introductory offer. So it's a really, really good question. And I think maybe that's a topic that we can hone in on in a news and
Yeah.
views. I think with that huge caveat that there is that introductory offer, I think publishers are likely going right for the sweet spot, for the subject area, for the journals that their researchers are also, submitting to. I think that may change and in subsequent years, but when you first go from an introductory offer into charging, I think you don't you may have just gotten your impact factor. Depending on the time of the year, that's something that's coming. You don't necessarily want to discourage submissions by putting on a huge APC. Now you may want to put a line in the sand for exclusivity around that journal. And so there may be folks out there who are going, oh no, we do exactly that. But I think that this is a data driven process now, and some of the things that you've seen us talk about in these charts are exactly the things that the publishers are discussing, many of them discussing with us. But yeah, Dan, would you agree or?
Yes. What you said.
Yeah. And I think too, what we've seen also is when new journals are launched and there might be that free period or there might be that discounted period, sometimes those get extended. Speaking of the data, when you're trying to build up submissions, publishers have flexibility in deciding we'll keep this discounted rate or we'll move it up, but not to list just yet. So, there is that flexibility in the pricing. Are you seeing a pattern of, oh, wait, sorry. Do you find the APCs you're looking at as all in? So, and I don't know that we look at this. Some publishers may charge additional fees on top of those APCs. They may be charging some sort of author fee to go along with that. Do we look at that at all? Are we finding,
And
anything in
so
the
we sort of look at it in passing because when you're gathering the data is there. I think the short answer is it's very, very rare because I think many people would see that as quote double dipping unquote. I have come across some publishers that will charge a premium for that sort of stuff. Please don't ask me to tell you which ones they are because they tend to be such outliers. Um, Maybe a slightly related question is some publishers might charge by page count. So say, well, we'll charge an APC for the first 5 pages of 5,000 words or whatever, and then ratchet up increases based on extent, basically, which is not, I think that's a, if you like, a legitimate part of the scaling the APC, and that's I would suggest a materially different a sort of philosophy from a submission fee or a image fee or that kind of page charges because we're doing something complicated. So I think things like color charges, especially bear in mind that in the days of the interwebs, remember, open access is an online only issue. As soon as you get into physical print, you incur all sorts of additional marginal costs. And of course, online color, you're not having to pay for a 4 color or 6 color printing process online in the same way that you would do in physical print. So I think in some ways there's a bit less of a need anyway. So short
Yeah,
answer is very, very rare.
yeah, I think we are also seeing instances where there are different APCs depending upon whether you want to fast track your article. And I think we are going to see growing complexity around these services. I've compared it in the past to like, frequent flyer programs for airlines. You're paying for a different level of service. You're paying to have more things put in rather than breaking it apart and doing it, a la carte. So I expect to see more complexity around this. But for the purposes of our methodology, we have to have a process that's clearly delineated. So when we go and look at a publisher page, we know that we're getting the like for like, as Dan mentioned.
Yeah, great. Thank you. So I'm going to combine up one of our audience questions with one of the topics that we were focusing on too in our discussions, which is funder and policy um, issues, mandates, questions, policies, whatever the case may be, that may be impacting APCs. So, as many of you know, Delta Think ran a survey this past year of researchers and authors, actually two, so we could establish trends on the impact of funding and policy changes on publishing and other aspects of that organizations are concerned about. And then in the past week or so, there have been additional um, mandates or questions or edicts that have come out in this regard. So, any sense of how these areas that may be impacting APC payments, putting limitations, or even removing APCs as a viable use of funding, how this might impact or what we see, what is our view of this, how this may impact, and any advice for publishers on responding.
I'll go first. I think too soon to tell is the short answer. So the recent headlines are relatively new. We did some analysis at the start of last year, I think, when the new US administration came in and suggested there would be a significant reduction in research funding. So we were able to try and project some numbers and based on some various journalist analyses and the statements as we understood them and the budget submitted by federal agencies, we could take a view of whether or not there might be a rise or fall in submissions and therefore a possible effect on the marketplace. We could do a similar exercise here. So based on a policy announcement, we do have data on the share of output coming out of different regions. So we could look at a policy announcement from a region, take a view on the volume coming out of there, the share of total global output, and therefore if average prices go up, down, or sideways, what might happen. That said, it's quite hard to get a view on prices paid by region because we don't have access to publishers' confidential invoicing data. We can kind of infer where submission or which regions of the world break down by authorship and sort of back that into an analysis that way. So before I get too much into the weeds of the technicalities of it, I think we could run some analysis to perhaps model out the changes. I suspect, however, they will probably be less than most people think. I've been doing this for long enough now to know the big scary headlines. By the time you realize that even the largest countries account for a relatively modest share of total output, and then when you scale all that down to say government agencies or to an individual funder, they can only move the needle only by so much. So I would suggest sometimes the data and the, if you like, the hyperbole or the worry don't necessarily align.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, as we've seen in the past, funders can have a dramatic impact on the market. There wasn't such of a thing as a transformative journal or a transformative agreement, setting aside the fact that are they transforming, towards something or not. We that all of those business models did come, from Coalition S. And so, who's to say we might not have a big new business model or business model changes, based on some of these things if they're very clearly defined. And, that was one of the things about, the criteria to declare a transformative journal is that it was very, progress over time, different percentages, numerical targets that you needed to hit. Um, I think one important thing to consider is, these grants take a long time, to play out. And so the publications that are coming out now are from grants that may have been, begun 3 years ago or more. And so they're going to be subject to the criteria that was in place, when that grant was awarded. we do a lot of interviews with researchers, and I know that right now they're just trying to keep their labs going. They're trying to keep their people employed, and they don't necessarily have the money sitting around, for APCs. And if they're not allowed to pull that out of their grant, something's got to give. And Lori referred to the survey that we did. There was, an indication that researchers were not going to have either the funding to conduct as much research and thus fewer articles overall, or the funding specifically for an APC to be able to produce an open access article. So these things are going to, take a little bit of time, to filter through. But the most recent, U.S. government pronouncements, edicts, budget proposals, are very vague. And anyone who, tries to kind of, we can all talk about what they mean, but we don't know exactly what they mean. And there's going to be obviously lots of challenges and things that happen. Yeah.
Yeah.
One thing to add to that, I just noticed in the webinar chat, somebody's mentioned that the RELX chief executive was asked last year if he was worried about the policy changes announced by the US president. And he basically said, quote, "Not worried as our business covers the whole world." I think it's a very good paraphrasing. I remember going through that report at the time, just to give you some numbers. I mean, as I say, a big corporate publisher, even a modestly sized publisher could have 8, 10, 12,000 institutional customers around the world. You're talking many, many thousands of institutional customers with a truly global footprint. So, I'm not here to advocate for or against or on behalf of any individual organization or company, but I think Eric Engstrom, the RELX's CEO, points were well made. If you're a big publisher, you cover a very, very wide waterfront, and so even a very, very large producer of output, such as the US, which will account for a few percent, 3, 4, 5% of output. Yes, that can be scary for a year or two, but once that change embeds, you've got so much other stuff going on that it's unlikely those changes are going to upset the entire apple cart. And the other thing to realize, particularly with significantly sized organizations, is they're running multi-year plans and they are used to these things happening. They're used to dealing with fluctuations in exchange rates. And we found this with pricing a few years back. And we also find this with our market sizing estimates. All things being equal, the publishing activity doesn't change at all, but the amount of revenues coming in can swing quite significantly simply because if you are a US publisher, for example, and you're getting 50% of your submissions from outside the US, if the dollar strengthens or weakens through the year, that's going to have a much, much more profound effect on the money flows than necessarily a particular funder changing their policies. So I think it's an interesting question, but certainly what I observe in our industry over the years is we are a remarkably resilient ecosystem. Elements of the ecosystem as a whole may wax and wane, but the averages tend to carry us through. And I think the sort of, if you like, the death of scholarly publishing has been over exaggerated for many years. And we have seen the great financial crash. We've seen swings in administrations. We've seen changes in European funders. I think the most profound effect is the one that Heather highlighted. When you get a really, really big funder that's trying to influence a change in business model, that can have a profound effect simply because people are shifting their toll booths where they exact their revenue, but that won't necessarily move the needle on the overall value or cost to people. It would more change the shape of things.
I think it also speaks to the need for diversification, for looking at your other markets to see how you can build them up and what can be done to alleviate pressures from one market
Yeah.
via other markets. We've got so many good questions and comments here. Just a note that someone had put in the Q&A that in January of 2025, the Gates Foundation discontinued support for APCs.
Yeah.
Does that influence APCs in some subjects? What they said was that they were doing that so that they could work to address inequities in current publishing models and reinvest in those funds elsewhere.
Candidly, they don't publish enough to move the needle. I remember the Gates Foundation, the vast majority of their focus is in actual fact on the ground practical interventions. So Yes, they are a significant funder. Yes, I think that policy is indicative of a wider trend. Mentioning no names, Eli, for example, it is speaking to a kind of repository first and then a so-called overlay publishing model. And that's been discussed since certainly the mid noughties to my awareness, and I dare say before that. But that's an example of where there's lots of headlines. I think there's lots of very interesting discussion, and it's interesting to work through that. But from a pure kind of hard-nosed data perspective, there's just not enough activity to move the needle. And so speaking as an analyst or someone who does analysis, every time these things come along, I'm looking for the dramatic headline. I'll plug in the data, hoping we'll get a big swing in the chart, and usually it's relatively small. And I have to sort of go back to the tail between my legs and say, well, it could be a little bit of this and a little bit of that. But yeah, it's all very, very good and interesting and valid discussion.
Yeah.
Yeah, and if you are, as Dan mentioned, the Gates Foundation, is not largely responsible for publications. They're also winding down the fund. So if you are a funder and you really want to make a big splash, in a specific area, don't try to do it after you've announced your fund is going to be sunset.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm going to broaden one of the questions in here. So, have we ever had funders or government policy arms come to us looking at our APC data or asking to look at our APC data before or as part of their analysis before they've made it?
Not to my knowledge. I don't know. You two are
Yeah.
closer to the commercial end of things. So that question back at you, Laurie, maybe.
Yeah, not that I am aware of, but it is a good
Yeah, I
question.
mean, yeah, it would be really, really nice. It would be we
Yes,
dream of it, but
yes,
Yeah, except for the fact that most research that's conducted by the government is intended to be public. So our APC data, while we're publishing our analyses, we don't make the data set public. So
yeah,
that would kind of set us up from a problematic perspective to be working,
yeah,
with someone who's going to publish it
true,
at the end. So,
true,
yeah.
true.
Oh, I suppose it depends if they want the data behind the report or just the
mm,
report to be. But yeah, and as a consultancy again, I'm not here to pitch our consulting services, but Delta thinks the bulk of Delta thinks work is bespoke work, and we have done work for funding agencies and NGOs to study these things and to study trends in output. So in that sense, we might be consulted on a per project basis like other consultancies in the industry. But for this particular data set, no, we haven't been consulted on the NIH's policy on capping XYZ or Coalition S's policy on setting recommended limits.
Yeah. And we someone put in the chat, these mandates or edicts or proposals, let's call them that right
Yeah.
now, are not limited to the US. We've
Yeah.
got a quote here in the chat, Cancer Research UK to stop funding open access publishing. So um, setting APCs along the lines of purchasing parities, so pricing to the market linked to GDP by country. Are we
Mhm.
are we seeing any of that?
Uh, I believe Elsevier started moving that way. Did they announce a policy on that? Somebody please correct me if I misremembered. Uh, we haven't systematically studied it, I'm looking at the prices. We as I said, we tend to take the stated US dollar price before any discount. So our method here would actually render all of that variation opaque. That said, we did do some analysis on purchasing power-based pricing. So for people who are not aware of this, different countries, so if you set a constant dollar amount, what might be cheap in somewhere, say Switzerland or in the US, that are relatively wealthy countries, the same dollar amount, even after exchange rates, could be very, very expensive for a less well-off country. If you really want a good explanation of that, Google the Big Mac Index, which the Economist magazine has produced as a sort of shorthand for that. There's basically, if you take the price of a Big Mac in any country and convert it to US dollars from their local rate to US dollars, you will find the amount of US dollars required to purchase a Big Mac varies depending on how well off the country is even though ostensibly it's the same product. So that's the notion here. Should publishers change their prices to reflect affordability regionally? As I said, we did some work on this. I think it could be beneficial, but it would essentially mean wealthier countries will need to pay more compared with less wealthy countries. So you get a zero-sum game. We haven't seen that manifest in detail in the prices list, but I said that there might be some companies that are edging towards that to a degree. And of course, remember, as a general rule, many publishers will follow the Research for Life or Hinari guidelines, where they will look at is usually World Bank data. They will classify publishers as to be sort of, if you like, low, medium, high income countries. I believe there's sort of three levels, and they will offer a different level of discounts for sort of medium and low income countries. So there's a sort of purchasing power, I think, baked into many publishers' pricing policies, which publishers will apply both to their open access pricing and to their subscription access pricing as well. So there's an element of this is just sort of how the industry does business, I
Yeah,
think.
the waivers and
Yeah.
discounts for those programs, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I just
And
saw a question pop up on gaming, the waiver
yeah,
system. I mean, I have or the pricing system. I have seen some publishers that say that the author who is based in the country that would pay the highest APC has to take it. So
yeah.
that
Um, and that gaming goes on. I've got had anecdotal evidence about that. And so particularly for my days working inside big publishers, it's just one of those things. So there could be author policies of take the most expensive, or you have to stick with the country of the corresponding author. I mean, different publishers will manage that, I think, in
Yeah.
different ways.
And the
But
same
yeah,
thing,
you
same
know,
thing impacts the read and publish. That
yeah,
comes in those conversations as well, gaming it a bit by
yeah,
picking the author who's going to get the best deal there. Um, can we talk a little bit about any differences by subject area? Any surprises? Was there anything in the analysis? And again, hot off the press, so we may not have uh, really dove into this area just yet, but anything that we can talk
I
about?
don't think we would say that we saw surprises. Dan and I were talking about this a little bit. I mean, I think we see the continuing increase in APCs for areas like, arts and the humanities. But they are starting from a lower point over time. So they have, a sense higher that they could grow. I mean, I for one think that a greater awareness in arts and humanities, is a good thing about open access. And as those journals become more established and as the researchers, are less shocked to see, that type of model, and many of them learned during the pandemic how beneficial it can be to have their research be openly available. One thing you noted, Dan, was a multidisciplinary journal
yeah.
pricing.
Um, so yeah, a couple of things. And actually, Heather, after we spoke, I dug into the table of that data a little bit more in our subscriber tool. So yeah, I think last year we noticed arts and humanities, and from memory, social sciences tended to have above average price increases. This year, that's fallen back only to arts and humanities. Social sciences seem to have fallen back onto trend. Come back to that in a second. Absolutely, the cheapest, the lowest price increase appear in multidisciplinary journals, whether they are fully open or whether they are hybrid. Um, One other thing I was pulling out of the numbers. Oh, the other thing on multidisciplinary, although the price increases in multidisciplinary might be very slightly lower than sorry, yeah, very slightly lower than average. Again, it might vary, and some of the most expensive journals sit in that category. So, you think of the Natures, the Cells, the very, very big high impact journals we will tend to classify typically under multidisciplinary because they're quite broad. Couple of other things I noticed for the first time this year, the average APC for an arts and humanities fully open journal it is no longer the cheapest. It used to be arts and humanities were amongst the cheapest. It's now overtaken physical sciences, and engineering and technology and social sciences. So arts and humanities averages have gone up quite a lot, by almost 20% in fully open arts and humanities journeys on average last year have gone up by almost 20%. And they've then leapfrogged their way up the league table when you look at their average APCs. I could probably speak for the next 3 hours pulling apart the table I'm looking at. That I'm sorry, you
For
folks can't
future
see.
news and views.
Yes.
For future news and views. Um, but it just goes to say it is really really nuanced. Your mileage really does vary between discipline and within discipline and from year to year. So maybe we can try some sort of league table, and think about how we publish that. And then of course within these disciplines, what might be happening, I don't know, in law could be very different from what might be happening in history, etc., etc. So even those sub headlines, mask, sub headlines, and so on.
Yeah. I'm just going to take really quickly, because I'll answer this one, but Dan and Heather, please chime in. Someone just asked whether there's any thoughts on the fact that publishers were previously providing Excel files of their APCs. Now they're doing PDFs or not at all, and what is that about? The only thing I'll say about it is harkening back to subscriptions and that model. You all likely remember when subscriptions were announced in May, June, July, and everybody posted them on their website with a full catalog of every price you can imagine. And now those are very hard to come by. And I think it speaks to customization of pricing, competitive intelligence, just making it harder to go through and just exact that information. So I imagine folks just don't want to publicly put it out there in such an easy format. That would be my guess. Dan or Heather, anything?
Uh, I mean, I don't know. I don't know if there's a specific publisher the question I had in mind. Certainly, as we go through this, there are still many publishers that will offer things in Excel. Sometimes there's a challenge of just finding them. I think a lot of it actually reflects the publisher's internal process, because publishing is still quite a manually driven process behind the scenes, let's be honest. The bigger publishers in particular, who may have got a greater level of investment in automating or semi-automating production systems, they will of course find it a lot easier to provide structured lists in multiple formats. Perhaps smaller publishers don't quite have that because they're assembling a list by hand. Some publishers, your point about customization, simply don't publish a price list at all in any format. You have to click through and declare the type of article, the country you're in, your inside leg measurement, and then finally you might get an amount in a currency. And some publishers like that have been consistently doing that because they understandably want to dice and slice pricing by territory, or that's perhaps just the system they've developed and they're not about to throw away their investment from many years. So we found your mileage really may vary, and that is partly the challenge for us when we do this exercise every year, and partly we feel the value to our clients and customers because we have to do all this heavy lifting so you, dear reader,
Yes.
don't have
And
to.
normalize.
Yeah, and yes, usually by this time each year, I'm crying in a little ball in a corner of a room somewhere, saying, "Why can't they all do it the same?" But
So we have
but
a
that
minute.
is the
Yeah.
industry we know and love, so I'm
Yeah,
not complaining
we
at
we
all.
have a minute to wrap up. Lots of information we did not get to, so please reach out if you have
Yeah.
lingering questions. Any closing comments, Heather, and then Dan?
I mean, it's never boring. So we're in interesting times for so many reasons, but I'm always excited to see the latest data.
My closing comment to everyone, please let us know if there's questions you have or analysis we want to do. We're taking a kind of best guess of what we think will be interesting to people. If you could let us know, then that can help us inform future webinars and future.
Future news and views. Yeah,
That's
yeah,
really
yeah,
useful
yeah.
to us.
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone. We have recorded this session and we will be sending around a link to that to those of you who signed up. within the next few days to a week. So look for that in your email. And thank you so much for joining and for your your questions to make this a lively discussion. And thanks, of course, to Heather and Dan for their excellent information and commentary.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Lori.
everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Bye.